It was an ordinary lunchtime at Riverwood High, but for one student, the cafeteria felt anything but ordinary. The girl, new to the school, had spent the past few days trying to keep a low profile. She wasn't the type to stand out or draw attention. She preferred to stay to herself, observing the busy school life around her. Today, just like any other day, she grabbed her tray, found an empty seat by the window, and sat down to eat her lunch in peace. She had always been an introvert, not because she disliked people, but because she found comfort in her own company. She had moved to Riverwood only a few weeks ago, and making new friends had been difficult. Her old school, where she'd grown up, had been a place where she'd felt a sense of belonging. But here everything felt so different. The faces were unfamiliar, and the voices were strange. She missed the comfort of her old school, but she had to remind herself that this was the next chapter in her life. She'd be fine. For now, though, it was just her and her lunch. She ate quietly, glancing occasionally out the window at the school grounds. Her thoughts were peaceful, and the noise of the cafeteria faded into the background. It was a time for her to recharge and prepare for the afternoon classes, but not everyone was focused on their lunch like she was. Across the cafeteria, a group of students were gathered together, laughing and talking loudly. One of them, a girl named Jess, had a reputation for being the most outspoken in her group. Jess had been known for her sharp tongue and quick wit. Her words could either make people laugh or make them feel small. Today, however, Jess had set her sights on the new girl, the one who was quietly eating alone by the window. The group had noticed her as soon as she entered the cafeteria. Jess had quickly whispered something to her friends, and before long, the group's attention shifted toward the girl. Jess, with her usual smirk, thought it was time to have some fun. She stood up from her seat and began walking toward the girl, her friends following behind her with eager anticipation. As Jess approached, the girl was unaware of what was coming. She had no reason to suspect that someone would want to bother her. She had always been the type to keep to herself, never looking for trouble. But Jess had already decided that she was going to make the girl feel out of place. It was something Jess did often, targeting people who didn't seem to fit in, especially those who seemed vulnerable. "Hey," Jess said loudly as she stood next to the girl's table, looking down at her with a mocking smile. "Why don't you leave this place? I don't think people like you belong here." The cafeteria grew quiet for a moment. Jess's voice had carried, and everyone around them had heard. The other students looked on, waiting for the girl to react, hoping she would stand up for herself. Some whispered to each other, while others watched in anticipation, waiting for the moment when the new girl would either crumble under the pressure or fight back. The girl, however, remained calm. She didn't flinch, and she didn't immediately stand up. She just kept her gaze steady on her plate, her hands wrapped around her fork. Her heart was beating a little faster now, but she didn't let it show. She had dealt with this kind of thing before. In fact, it felt familiar, the feeling of being singled out for no reason other than someone's desire to make themselves feel superior. But she wasn't going to let it get to her. Not this time. Jess, seeing that the girl wasn't reacting the way she'd hoped, grew more annoyed. She leaned in closer, her voice even louder now. "What's the matter? You too scared to leave? Are you just going to sit there and take it?" The girl finally lifted her eyes, looking Jess straight in the face. She didn't speak right away. She just stared, her expression calm but firm. The silence between them stretched on, and Jess began to feel a little uneasy. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Jess was used to getting a reaction, either a fight or a retreat. But this girl, she wasn't giving her either. The group of students around Jess shifted uncomfortably. They could see that this wasn't going as planned. Jess was used to having the upper hand in situations like this. But for the first time, she wasn't sure how to proceed. The girl placed her fork down slowly, her eyes never leaving Jess. She took a deep breath and, in the most controlled voice, said, "I'm not going anywhere. If you have a problem with me sitting here, that's your issue, not mine." There was a pause. Jess was taken aback. This wasn't what she expected. She had expected the girl to shrink away, to be embarrassed, maybe even cry. But instead, she was standing her ground. The group around Jess started to murmur among themselves. Some were unsure of how to react. Others began to feel uncomfortable, as if they'd witnessed something that didn't feel right. Jess's face flushed, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of her own words. Her usual sharp tongue had failed her. She had tried to break someone down, but instead the girl had simply stood firm. Jess opened her mouth to say something else, but before she could, the girl stood up from her seat. Her calm demeanor remained unchanged. She didn't raise her voice, but her presence suddenly filled the space around her. She stood tall, making sure to maintain eye contact with Jess, who now looked somewhat uncertain. "I'm not going to let you or anyone else tell me where I belong," the girl said, her voice soft but full of strength. "I have every right to sit here just like everyone else." With those words, the girl gathered her things. She didn't make a scene, but she didn't back down either. She picked up her tray and began walking toward the teacher who was stationed at the front of the cafeteria, observing the students as they ate. The eyes of the entire cafeteria followed her as she moved, but she didn't look back. She didn't need to. Jess watched her walk away, a mix of frustration and confusion crossing her face. She had thought that she could push this girl around, that she could make her feel small, but the girl hadn't flinched. She hadn't even been intimidated. And as the girl walked away, Jess realized something. She hadn't won this time. In fact, she hadn't even come close. The girl didn't say anything as she walked away, her steps steady and purposeful. She was fully aware of the eyes following her. The silence that had filled the cafeteria was starting to fade, and soft murmurs began to ripple through the room. Some students were whispering to each other, exchanging glances, while others were still processing what had just happened. She reached the front of the cafeteria, where a teacher was standing near the food line, making sure everything was in order. The teacher had witnessed the exchange, though from a distance. She had seen Jess approach the new girl, heard the sharp words, and watched as the girl walked toward her with quiet strength. The teacher had been impressed by the girl's composure, but had refrained from intervening until now. The girl stood for a moment, looking up at the teacher, who noticed the calm but serious expression on her face. The teacher immediately recognized that something had happened. "Is everything okay?" the teacher asked gently, her voice kind and concerned. The girl nodded, her gaze steady. She wasn't angry or upset. She was simply asserting her own space. "Yes, everything's fine," she replied. "I just want to let you know what happened, though." Without hesitation, she explained the situation, the way Jess had approached her, the cruel words she'd said, and how the girl had responded. The teacher listened intently, her expression softening as she heard the story. She could see how the girl had handled the situation with dignity, even though Jess had tried to make her feel small. After hearing the girl out, the teacher offered a few words of reassurance. "I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself," she said. "It's not always easy, especially when people try to push you around. But you did the right thing by not letting her get to you." The girl felt a sense of relief. It wasn't that she wanted to make a big deal out of it. She just didn't want to let someone walk all over her, especially when she had done nothing wrong. She didn't expect a reward or praise. She just needed to stand her ground. But hearing the teacher's words made her feel like her actions had been validated. The teacher paused for a moment and then said, "If you ever need support or anything else, don't hesitate to reach out. I'll make sure Jess knows this kind of behavior won't be tolerated." The girl nodded again, grateful for the teacher's kindness, but also determined not to let this incident define her. She wasn't the type to run to an adult every time someone said something rude. She had learned over the years that sometimes the best way to handle things was to deal with them yourself, especially when it came to people like Jess. "I'll be okay," she said softly. "I just don't want it to happen again." The teacher smiled reassuringly. "I understand. But remember, if it does, we'll handle it." The girl returned to her seat by the window, the whole cafeteria still buzzing with whispers about the scene that had unfolded. But now it was different. The students who had been watching were no longer just curious, they were starting to feel something else. Some of them, who had been intimidated by Jess before, were now beginning to admire the girl's quiet strength. The bully, who had once been the center of attention, was losing her grip on the crowd. Jess, however, was not feeling the same way. As soon as the girl had walked away, Jess had stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. Her friends had looked at her expectantly, waiting for her to say something, to make a joke, or to somehow take control of the situation. But Jess had no words. The tables had turned, and for the first time in a long time she felt small. She had tried to humiliate the new girl, thinking it would be easy. After all, Jess had done it before countless times. She was used to making others feel less than they were. She had always been the loud one, the one who commanded attention, but this time the new girl hadn't cowered. She hadn't flinched. She hadn't even looked scared. Instead, she had stood up for herself with a calmness that Jess couldn't understand. Jess glanced around the cafeteria, hoping to see someone else who would back her up. But everyone was focused on the girl who had just walked away. They were no longer looking at Jess with admiration or even fear. Instead, some were talking quietly to each other, their expressions mixed with surprise and respect for the new girl. One of Jess's friends, a girl named Kate, nudged her and said quietly, "That was unexpected." Jess didn't respond right away. She wasn't sure what to say. Part of her wanted to laugh it off, to act like nothing had happened. But another part of her, a part she rarely let show, felt a pang of doubt. Was she wrong to target the new girl? Had she gone too far? "I didn't think she'd do that," Jess finally muttered. "I thought she'd just get up and leave. I didn't expect her to stand up to me like that." Kate raised an eyebrow. "Maybe she's not as easy to mess with as you thought." Jess shook her head, trying to push the feeling of uncertainty aside. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice sharp. "I'll just find another way to deal with her." But deep down, Jess knew it wasn't going to be that simple. The new girl had stood her ground, and Jess couldn't help but feel the sting of her own failure. She had wanted to assert her power, but now she felt weaker than ever. As the lunch period came to an end, Jess found herself replaying the moment over and over in her mind. The girl hadn't backed down. She hadn't run away. She had faced her head on, and in that moment, Jess realized something she hadn't expected. This girl wasn't afraid of her. And maybe, just maybe, Jess wasn't the one in control anymore. The girl, on the other hand, had no intention of letting this incident occupy her thoughts for too long. She returned to her class after lunch, the quiet buzz of the school life around her. It wasn't the first time she had been targeted, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But today she had taken a stand. And for her, that was enough. She wasn't going to let one person's cruelty define her, especially not someone who thrived on putting others down. She had already made it through the hardest part. Now she could focus on the rest of her day, keeping her head high and moving forward. She had learned over the years that sometimes the best thing to do was simply keep walking, keep moving, and never let anyone make you feel less than you are. The days that followed the confrontation in the cafeteria felt different for both the new girl and Jess. For the girl, there was a sense of quiet relief. The weight of that one moment, standing up for herself, not backing down, had settled into something more than just a defense against Jess's cruelty. It felt like a small victory, not just for her, but for anyone who had ever been in a similar situation and stayed silent. She hadn't sought out a confrontation, but when the moment came, she stood her ground. As the week passed, whispers about the incident spread throughout the school. The new girl, who had once been an anonymous face in the cafeteria, was suddenly the subject of conversation. Some students admired her for the way she handled herself. They saw in her a quiet kind of strength, something that wasn't flashy or loud, but firm. It was a rare trait, especially in a school where power often came from being loud, confident, or popular. She wasn't any of those things, but she had shown something more powerful: dignity. By the middle of the week, she started to notice subtle changes. Students who had ignored her before were starting to acknowledge her. In the hallways, a few would smile and say hello. It was small, but it was enough to make her feel like maybe she wasn't so invisible after all. She didn't want to be a spectacle, but she also didn't want to hide in the shadows either. The respect she had earned wasn't something she asked for, but it was a sign that the school's dynamic was beginning to shift. On the other hand, Jess's world had started to feel a little smaller. She wasn't used to being the one on the outside, the one being avoided. In the past, she had been the one who could make people laugh, the one who could turn any situation into a joke. But now people were starting to look at her differently. The students who had once laughed at her insults were no longer so eager to join in. They weren't even laughing at her jokes anymore. One of Jess's closest friends, who had always been in her corner, pulled her aside one afternoon after class. "You know," her friend started, "people have been talking. They're saying you went too far with the new girl." Jess's face tightened. "What are you talking about?" "You've been messing with her for weeks now," her friend continued, glancing around as if to make sure no one was listening. "And after what happened in the cafeteria, Some people are starting to think maybe you crossed the line. Jess clenched her fists at her sides. She didn't want to hear it. She had always been the one in control, the one who called the shots. But this was different. The new girl had turned everything upside down. Jess had expected her to crumble under pressure, but she hadn't. And now, Jess was the one who felt off balance. "You think I went too far?" Jess asked, her voice tinged with frustration. Her friend shrugged. "I don't know. I just think it's getting weird. You've got to be careful. People are starting to look at you like you're the problem now." Jess didn't respond. She wanted to snap back to defend herself, but she knew her friend was right. Something had changed. She wasn't the one people looked to for reassurance or laughs anymore. They were looking at her like she was the one who had made the mistake. Jess had been in control of the cafeteria, but now the girl who had sat quietly by herself was the one with all the attention. The feeling of unease followed Jess through the rest of the week. She tried to act like everything was fine, to pretend she wasn't bothered by the way people were starting to treat her, but it was hard to ignore the growing sense of isolation. Even her friends weren't laughing at her jokes the way they used to. It was like they had suddenly realized something. Jess wasn't the powerful figure she thought she was. Meanwhile, the new girl, though still mostly keeping to herself, noticed the shift as well. The attention she was getting wasn't the kind she had expected. At first, she had felt awkward and uncertain about the sudden change in how people treated her. But as the days went by, she started to feel more comfortable. It was subtle, but she could tell that her peers were beginning to view her differently. It wasn't that they were suddenly her best friends, but there was a shift. She had earned their respect, and that in itself was more than she had hoped for. One afternoon, she found herself sitting in the library, working on an assignment, when she saw a familiar face approaching. It was one of the girls who had been part of Jess's group, the ones who had stood by and watched as Jess had tried to humiliate her. The girl, whose name she didn't know very well, hesitated before sitting down at the table next to her. "Hey," the girl said, looking a little unsure of herself. "Can we talk?" The new girl raised an eyebrow but nodded. She didn't know what this was about, but she was willing to listen. "Sure, what's up?" The girl shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Look, I just wanted to say, I think what you did in the cafeteria was really brave." The new girl was surprised by the compliment. She wasn't used to people speaking to her like this, especially after what had happened with Jess. "Thanks," she said, keeping her tone polite but neutral. It wasn't really a big deal, though. The girl gave her a small smile. "It was, though. People have been talking about it, and, well, I just wanted you to know that I think you handled yourself really well. Jess isn't exactly the nicest person, but she has a lot of influence around here. You really threw her off balance." The new girl was taken aback. She hadn't realized that people were talking about it that much. She had simply stood up for herself because it was the right thing to do. But hearing someone say that made her realize just how much of an impact that one moment had. "Thanks," she said again, this time with a hint of a smile. "I didn't mean to cause trouble. I just don't like being pushed around." The girl nodded. "I get it. It's just, a lot of people are noticing you now. You've kind of become this symbol of standing up for yourself. It's not something we see a lot around here, especially with people like Jess." The new girl felt a little awkward with all the attention, but she appreciated the kind words. It wasn't that she wanted to be a symbol. She just wanted to be treated like everyone else. But it was clear now that her actions had meant something to more people than she realized. As the week wore on, Jess found herself in the same spot. Her usual confidence was nowhere to be found, and the more she tried to regain control, the more she felt like she was losing it. She tried to confront the new girl a few times, but each time she was met with silence. The girl wasn't afraid of her anymore. She wasn't even acknowledging Jess the way she had before. It was like she had moved on, leaving Jess in the past, and Jess, for the first time, didn't know what to do. The weeks passed, and the tension that had once filled the halls of Riverwood High seemed to dissipate, but in a way that neither Jess nor the new girl expected. For Jess, it wasn't just the humiliation from the cafeteria incident that weighed on her now. It was the realization that she had lost her grip on the very thing that had always given her power: control. She tried to keep up appearances, putting on her usual act, making jokes, and trying to gather her friends around her again. But the more she tried, the more it became clear that her previous dominance was slipping through her fingers. Her friends weren't laughing at her jokes the same way. They were no longer following her lead. Instead, they seemed to be drifting away, and she was left standing on the outside, unsure of how to regain what she had lost. One afternoon, Jess found herself sitting at a table in the cafeteria with a few of her old friends. The usual banter that filled the table was now replaced with awkward silences. Jess tried to break the tension by telling a joke, but it fell flat. Nobody laughed. She looked around, sensing the unease. There were whispers. Some students were glancing at her, some looking at the new girl. It felt like everyone was waiting for Jess to do something, anything to regain their attention. But Jess wasn't sure what that something was anymore. Across the room, the new girl was sitting at her usual spot by the window. She was eating her lunch quietly, as she always did. The difference now, however, was that she wasn't sitting alone in the way she had when she first arrived. A few students, mostly those who had been quietly watching from the sidelines, were now joining her for lunch. They were mostly quiet too, but there was a mutual understanding between them that hadn't existed before. It wasn't that the new girl had become popular exactly. She wasn't the center of attention, and she wasn't looking to be. But she had something now that Jess hadn't anticipated: respect. People respected her not because she was loud or popular, but because she had stood her ground. She hadn't let someone push her around, and that kind of quiet strength had made people look at her in a different way. Jess couldn't help but watch from her table. It felt like the entire cafeteria had changed. The energy had shifted. People who had once followed her now seemed to be gravitating toward the new girl, and Jess felt a sense of isolation like never before. A week later, Jess found herself walking down the hallway, her head down, lost in thought. She had tried to patch things up with her friends, but it felt forced. She had tried to get people to notice her again, but it was like they had moved on without her. The silence in the cafeteria, the way everyone was turning their attention toward the new girl, it all felt like a constant reminder of what she had lost. As she walked past the locker area, she saw a group of students laughing, and for a brief moment she thought she might join them. But as she neared, she realized they weren't laughing at something she had said. They were laughing at something the new girl had said. Jess stopped in her tracks, her heart sinking. The new girl, sitting with a few others at a nearby table, was speaking softly, but with a confidence Jess hadn't heard before. She wasn't drawing attention to herself in the way Jess would have, but there was something about her calm, steady voice that had caught everyone's attention. Jess could hear bits of the conversation as she stood there, listening. "I'm not saying I'm perfect," the new girl was saying, "but I've learned that sometimes the best way to deal with people is to just walk away. You don't have to stoop to their level." The group was nodding along, some laughing, some just watching her with a newfound respect. Jess couldn't hear the rest of the conversation clearly, but she knew enough to understand that the new girl was speaking about something bigger. She was no longer just the quiet girl in the corner. She had become someone people wanted to listen to. For the first time, Jess realized something she had been avoiding. The new girl had won. Not in the way Jess would have defined winning, through power or dominance, but in a much quieter, more enduring way. The new girl had earned her place, and she hadn't done it by trying to take anyone else's. She had simply stood up for herself, and in doing so, she had earned the respect of the students who mattered. Jess had always believed that power came from making others feel small, from being the loudest in the room. But she was starting to see that true power came from the ability to stand firm, to be unshaken by the words or actions of others, and that was something the new girl had in spades. Later that day, Jess found herself standing by her locker, lost in thought. The group she had tried to be a part of had grown distant. Her friends, those who had once been her closest allies, were now talking to the new girl more than they were talking to her. Jess was beginning to understand that the respect she had once commanded wasn't something she could demand anymore. It had to be earned, and the new girl had done just that. As Jess tried to gather her thoughts, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned around and saw the new girl walking toward her. For a moment, Jess thought about walking away, about pretending she didn't care, but something stopped her. The new girl paused in front of her. She didn't say anything at first. There was a quiet understanding between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of what had happened over the past few weeks. Finally, the new girl spoke. "I just wanted to say, I didn't mean to make things difficult for you," she said quietly. her voice calm and kind. "I never wanted to cause any trouble. I just wanted to be treated like everyone else." Jess looked at her, unsure of what to say. The new girl wasn't looking for an apology or sympathy. She was simply acknowledging what had happened, what Jess had tried to do to her and how she had responded. "I didn't expect to change things the way I did," the new girl continued. "But I guess sometimes you just have to stand your ground." Jess nodded slowly. It was almost like the new girl was offering her an olive branch, but Jess wasn't sure if she was ready to accept it. She had spent so long trying to be in control, to be the one who others looked to for approval, but now she felt lost. She wasn't sure who she was anymore or where she fit in. The new girl smiled softly. "I hope you're okay." Jess stood there for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Part of her wanted to lash out, to remind the new girl that she wasn't the only one who had struggled. But another part of her felt a strange sense of gratitude. The new girl hadn't rubbed her victory in Jess's face. She hadn't gloated or made her feel worse. Instead, she had simply acknowledged the situation with quiet humility. "I'm fine," Jess said, her voice tight. "I'll be okay." The new girl gave her a small smile and walked away, leaving Jess standing there alone with her thoughts. For the first time in a long time, Jess didn't feel like she had control. But maybe that was okay. Maybe it was time to let go of the need to control everything around her. As she watched the new girl walk away, Jess realized that things were never going to be the same. But in a strange way, that was exactly what she needed. The days after their brief conversation in the hallway felt like a turning point for Jess. It was as if something inside her had shifted, though she wasn't entirely sure what it was. She wasn't quite ready to admit it to herself, but she knew something had changed. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like she was constantly trying to hold everything together. She wasn't fighting to maintain her reputation or struggling to reclaim the power she had once held so effortlessly. Instead, she started to think about the things that really mattered. The new girl, on the other hand, seemed completely unbothered by all the tension that had once been around her. She continued with her quiet routine, sitting by the window in the cafeteria, doing her work in class and offering kind words to anyone who needed them. It wasn't that she was indifferent to the changes happening around her. She just didn't feel the need to make a big deal out of it. Her actions had already spoken for themselves. One afternoon, the new girl found herself sitting in the library, absorbed in a book, when she noticed a familiar face walking by. It was Jess. Jess was alone this time, not surrounded by the group of friends she had once kept close. The new girl watched as Jess paused for a moment, clearly hesitant. For a second, she thought Jess might turn around and walk away, but instead, she walked over to the table where the new girl was sitting. "Do you mind if I sit here?" Jess asked, her voice softer than usual. It was a simple question, but it carried a weight that neither of them had expected. The new girl looked up, surprised, but nodded. "Of course." Jess sat down across from her, her hands resting on the table. There was a moment of silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt more like an unspoken understanding, as if both of them knew that the past few weeks had changed them, and now they were left to figure out what that meant. "I just wanted to say something," Jess started after a moment, her voice tentative. I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened, and I know I messed up. I don't know why I treated you the way I did." The new girl raised an eyebrow, not expecting an apology, but listening intently nonetheless. She wasn't sure if Jess was looking for validation or just a chance to get things off her chest. Either way, she was willing to hear her out. "I guess I thought that if I could make people laugh or be the loudest in the room, I'd always have control. I didn't realize that control wasn't the same thing as respect," Jess continued, her voice steady but with a hint of regret. "I see now that I've been, I don't know, just trying to be something I'm not, and it didn't work. I hurt you and I'm sorry." The new girl didn't respond right away. She wasn't sure what to say, but she could tell that Jess was being genuine. For a moment, she remembered how different she had felt when she first came to Riverwood, how it had seemed like no one noticed her, and how her silence had made her a target. But now things felt different. She wasn't afraid anymore, and she wasn't angry with Jess either. People made mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes were the only way to learn. "I don't think it's about control," the new girl finally said, her voice calm. "Maybe we all just want to feel like we belong, you know? Like we matter. But I've learned that it's not about putting others down to feel better about yourself. It's about lifting others up." Jess nodded slowly, processing the words. She had always been the one who commanded attention, the one who made others feel small so she could feel bigger. But now, sitting across from the new girl, she realized how much she had overlooked. The new girl wasn't trying to be noticed. She was simply being herself, and that was enough to make people respect her. "I guess I never really thought about it that way," Jess said quietly, her eyes meeting the new girl's. "I was so focused on getting people to look at me, to see me as someone powerful, that I didn't notice how I was hurting others in the process." The new girl smiled gently, her expression not one of judgment, but of understanding. "It's okay. We all have to learn, right?" For the first time in a long while, Jess felt a sense of relief. She hadn't been expecting forgiveness, but she appreciated the new girl's kindness. She realized that this wasn't about proving who was right or wrong. It was about moving forward. And for the first time in a while, she felt like she was on the right path. From that day on, something changed in the school's dynamic. Jess didn't suddenly become the most popular student again, but she didn't need to. She no longer craved the constant attention or the approval of others. Instead, she started focusing on the things that mattered more: genuine friendships, kindness, and respect. She became more aware of how her words affected others, and she began to take responsibility for her actions. The new girl, too, started to feel more at ease. She had never set out to be a symbol of strength or courage, but in the weeks that followed, she began to realize that sometimes standing up for yourself could inspire others to do the same. She hadn't meant to change the school's culture, but by simply being herself, she had inadvertently shown others that there was power in being kind, in standing firm without being cruel. In the cafeteria, the atmosphere had shifted. Jess still sat with her old group, but it was different now. There was less tension, less fear of judgment. She didn't feel the need to make jokes at someone else's expense to fit in. Instead, she found herself laughing with her friends, sharing real conversations. It wasn't about trying to be the loudest anymore. It was about being honest and open. The new girl continued to sit by the window, but now she wasn't alone. More and more students began joining her for lunch. They weren't looking for her to entertain them or to make them feel better about themselves. They were simply drawn to her quiet confidence, the way she made them feel seen without needing to be the center of attention. As the school year went on, both Jess and the new girl found themselves in a place of peace. They didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Jess had learned that real strength came from within, from the ability to stand by your beliefs without trying to tear others down. The new girl had learned that she didn't have to fight every battle alone. Sometimes all it took was staying true to who you were. And so Riverwood High slowly transformed. It wasn't an overnight change, but it was a change that mattered. Students who had once felt isolated or unseen began to find their voices. Jess and the new girl, though very different, had both learned valuable lessons. They had learned that true strength didn't come from dominating others, it came from lifting them up. In the end, both of them had found their place, not through power or intimidation, but through kindness, respect, and the courage to be themselves.